was early morning on a farm outside of Dublin in the beginning of October 1845. A low, cool fog hung over the sprawling fields of potatoes, clinging to the workers' bare arms and draping across their backs. Inside the wooden barn, the farm's owner tugged at his beard with one dirt-covered hand, staring concerned at a split-open potato that had been laid before him. The potato looked like the inside of a spider's nest. It was almost entirely hollowed out at its core, with the walls rotting away to leave a sour odor hanging in the room. The fields had not been as lush as the owner would expect at this time of year. The leaves on their crops were wilting from the barn all the way to the dale by the woods. The owner called an early harvest, in an attempt to save what he could, and as his workers toiled away at the black earth beneath his feet, one thought laid heavy upon his mind. Without a crop to sell, how was he to pay his British landlord? More importantly, perhaps, how was he going to feed his family? What he did not know at the time was that this crop failure was the beginning of a great famine, one that would see nearly a quarter of Ireland's population evicted from their homes, forced to emigrate, starved beyond belief, and killed. But like many tragedies, this could have been prevented, or at the very least mitigated by the British Parliament to prevent over 1 million needless deaths. In this video, we will dive into the history of the Irish Potato Famine. We will explore the late blight that wiped out a crop on which a third of Ireland relied on to survive. We will look at the British apathy, religious discrimination, and incompetent governance that compounded the issue 1,000-fold. Finally, we will touch on the lasting effects, as Ireland learned they could no longer trust their lands in control of the crown. The culprit of such a deadly blight was none other than Phytophthora infestans, a water fungus that had traveled from Mexico to the United States, from New York ports to London ones, and from the British countryside, carried by the wind and rain, to Ireland, where it suddenly began to run rampant. A farmer's account in a letter to Trevelyan, his local pastor, survived through history, and was published in Noel Kissiny's book, The Irish Famine. The farmer writes, quote, "The luxuriant stalks soon withered, the leaves decayed, the disease extended to the tubers, and the stench from the rotting of such an immense amount of rich vegetable matter became almost intolerable. I saw my splendid crop fast disappearing and melting away under this fatal disease. I tried to dig the potatoes rapidly, in the hope of saving something. I set up a temporary machine for the conversion of the tubers into starch, but the final result was that the produce of the entire crop yielded about 40 pounds in starch, while the cost of grinding the pulp and erecting machinery amounted to about twice that sum." End quote. Ireland wasn't the only country affected by this fungus. France, Britain, Scotland, and the majority of Europe all saw crops fail to some extent. However, what caused Ireland to be so deeply affected was a fundamental mistake in the way it grew its crops. It's important to note that the humble potato that a third of the country relied on did not originate in Ireland, or even Europe. The potato originated in the Andes Mountains, in modern-day Peru. Coming over to Europe in the 1600s, the potato became a staple because of how easy it was to grow. In return for minimal effort, the self-duplicating, affordable crop was a highly nutritious, delicious, and healthy meal. When it was introduced, it became the lifeblood of the poorest third of Ireland, who, in many cases, couldn't afford much else. That would have been the end to it, if it wasn't for the corn laws that Britain imposed on its neighbor across the Channel. While Ireland did grow a variety of crops, corn, wheat, vegetables, and so on, those were heavily exported to England, with only payment in return. These crops were more scarce, but the grain laws held the prices high to assist the farmers who were growing the wheat, and incentivize them to keep doing so. This had the effect of making seeds for wheat and corn too expensive and too unprofitable for the rest of the Irish farmers to have any incentive to grow. It created a monoculture. In the first year, the blight destroyed almost half the harvest. As 1845's winner of the Most Ironic Name contest, Sir Robert Peel held the office of Prime Minister when the famine struck. As a member of England's Tory party, his first act towards relief for the famine was to attempt to repeal the Corn Laws, which in the mind of his party had been negatively influencing the free market for years. The Parliament even brought £100,000 worth of maize and corn from America to supplement the soon-to-be hungry Irish people's diets. But many argue that what Sir Robert Peel did do was too little and too late. First reports came to Peel about the famine on October 15th. An emergency meeting wasn't called until the 31st, once all the digging had been completed, and it was all too clear that there would not be enough food to go around. In The Great Hunger by Cecil Woodham Smith, the author writes, "Though he himself was still willing to hope that present fears might be exaggerated, nevertheless, our Lord Lieutenant does not readily give credit to false alarms." He also added, "Sir Robert Peel has been Chief Secretary for 6 years. During that period, he has shown no liking for the Irish character, no sympathy with Irish ambitions, cordially detested Irish life, and had identified himself with the extreme Protestant party." Sir Robert Peel didn't make his best effort when facing the Irish famine, likely because he did not know the full extent of the damages his lack of effort would cause. On the 5th of December, just over a month and a half since first learning of the blight, Peel attempted to resign. Upon learning that there was no willing replacement for him, he was forced to remain in office and oversee the relief effort. In March of 1846, he did make some further progress in establishing a program to feed all those affected by the famine, primarily using British taxpayer money and foreign food imports. But his lack of success eventually forced him to resign again in June that year. What the people of Ireland didn't know is that his successor would be far, far worse. The new Whig administration, under Lord John Russell, was not apathetic towards the famine, it was spiteful. The new Prime Minister's first act was to halt all governmental food and relief programs, under the belief that the market and the local economies of Ireland would be able to provide for themselves. Grain and corn exports continued to drain from the country due to Peel's failure the year prior. This left one option for the starving lower class. An artifact of the decades since, the Poor Laws of 1834 had previously established government-owned workhouses. These workhouses were originally designed to bring the poor and unfortunate out of poverty through menial labor. Those who could work were put to simple tasks, like breaking rocks, farming and chopping wood for the men, and sewing, tailoring, and household chores for the women and children. As the final option for a recently evicted Irish farming family, of which there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions, these few workhouses became quickly overwhelmed. Lord John Russell and Lord Robert Peel had both hoped to find a temporary solution for a temporary problem. But the following October, the harvest was almost entirely destroyed. The problem was here to last until something could be done about it. From the beginning of 1847, as the workhouses were overwhelmed and the government struggled to find a solution to the problem, conditions were just right amongst the masses to cause widespread and devastating outbreaks of what was known at the time as famine fever. It was presumed to be caused by starving, thirsty people attempting to sate themselves using the rotten potatoes, and to slake their thirst with the water pooling in the footprints and wagon tracks along the muddy roads leading into the cities. Today, famine fever is more widely known as cholera. The damp, crowded, and unclean conditions of the workhouses caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. People would not, on average, die from hunger itself, but instead from what they tried to eat to sate it. What made the outbreak worse was it spread to the ships that ferried Irish immigrants to America. In her prestige, America was the best way out for those who could not bear to stay in the workhouses, or who were capable of picking up route and heading westward. However, these ships were not all they were made out to be. Because of their cramped conditions, poor food, and uncaring Protestant British sailors, they colloquially became known as coffin ships. William Richard Harris recorded in his book, The Catholic Church in the Niagara Peninsula, an account of one of the immigrants from the Julius Caesar, a coffin ship that saw a quarter of its 400 immigrants die on the 2-month journey across the Atlantic. Harris annotates, he said, No, I'm a heretic. They won't like it if I touch his corpse. Let his own people bury him. Let them sew him up in canvas, tie a weight to his feet, say a prayer over him, and bury him like a Christian. Additionally, he writes, sometimes we'd go a couple days without any deaths at all, and sometimes we'd bury 2 or 3 a day. One day, 6 people died, and we threw them overboard. Those whose friends had money got a better funeral than the others. They were sewn up in a cloth by the sailors who got pay for doing it, and they had weights to sink them. Those who could not afford this luxury were thrown overboard to the sharks, with their clothes on, exactly as they died. At this point, the year referred to today as Black 47, there was no one consistent way out of the famine and fever, aside from death. For those in the workhouses and on the coffin ships, it was not a matter of whether they made the right choice, but a matter of if they would survive the choice they made. But to some Irish nationalists, there was another possibility of escape. Many would dismiss the Young Irelander Rebellion in the early summer of 1848 as a simple footnote from history. But it's possible that this little skirmish at Widow McCormack's house on July 29th would sow the first seeds of a new Irish independence. In December of Black 47, the British government, which had continued to delay, corrupt, and outright deny services to the Irish people, began to switch its policy, not towards helping relieve the pressure that it was causing, but to police and restrain the hungry Irish people from committing crimes to stay alive. The famine had come back stronger than ever in 47, and would strike again in 48 and 49. There was no end in sight. So, on July 29th of 1848, a rising rebellion was heated to a flashpoint in County Tipperary. An armed mob numbering in the hundreds and led by William Smith O'Brien laid siege to around 50 royal policemen who had barricaded themselves in the house of Widow McCormack. It was at this skirmish that the Irish tricolour flag flew for the very first time. The battle concluded when 2 of the mob were killed and the rest retreated. The leaders either fled the country to America or were arrested, tried, and then banished. The famine would end in 1850, but the ripples it created would spread out for centuries to come. The rebellion would rise in Ireland once again, and after a period known as the Troubles, it would gain independence from Great Britain in 1921. The green, white, and orange tricolour still flies above its verdant lands today. By the end of the famine, well over 1 million Irish people were dead, and another 1 million or so had emigrated from the country. 200,000 people died in the workhouses, and it's believed that hunger accounted for only half the deaths in the famine, with the other half being contributed to cholera, violence, or other related symptoms of the famine. Ireland's population was reduced by more than a quarter, and by 1910, it would reduce further to only half the number it had before the famine. Ireland's population still hasn't recovered, sitting today at 7.1 million, a full 1 million people shy of the pre-famine number. Since the famine, both Peel and Russell, as well as Queen Victoria, collectively have left one large patch of rot in the history of the British Isles, a famine that by all accounts shouldn't have been nearly as bad as it was. The conversation continues today about why England showed such apathy and disdain for the Irish people they governed. It was a conversation about culture, religion, and most importantly, class. During a famine, the rich don't go hungry. The discrimination and deceit the Irish experienced was the work of their conquerors, the upper class who had perceived themselves as better, more deserving of the few resources available. Today, hundreds of million people continue to go hungry. Wars, climate change, and disease continue to put the world's fragile infrastructure chains in constant peril. Discrimination, class warfare, and rebellion are consistently prevalent across the globe. At times like these, it's best to look back into history and ask, what lessons can it teach us? How can we persuade our leaders to care for the minority? How do we ensure that the territories we hold are not crushed by our indifference? How can we develop and improve our farming practices to ensure that famine does not strike us, our neighbors, or any of our associated territories again. As a final note, the US is preventing itself from farming with monocultures as best it can. However, there is one standout monoculture that persists even today: corn. It is ever present in the American diet and culture. Nearly every American relies on it to some extent, not knowing its true value. From our popcorn to our artificial sweeteners, our sodas, our alcohol through ethanol production. Our meat industries are fueled by corn. So, next time you eat a French fry, or drink anything with high fructose corn syrup, think about the Irish, who subsisted heavily on just one crop until the day it was taken away from them. Think about the British Parliament, who refused to provide substantial aid for half a decade. Think about the immigrants, who risked their lives to struggle against cholera and the deadly journey to America, who are so numerous that you see their descendants around you nearly every day. And most importantly, think about that cold October morning, when a man who would see his farm taken from him, who would see his family slowly starve and die of sickness, who was forced to gamble it all for a glimmer of hope, first realized, as he looked at a rotten potato, that something was terribly wrong.